My name's Bill Walther. Give you a little background about my history with the railroad. And it started in 1964, and I was going to college at Cal Poly, and I was looking for a summer job, and my dad said, well, they're hiring brakemen down at 6th and Main. You ought to go down there and see if you can get a job as a brakeman. So I went down there, and they hired me. And what they did in those days was they hired people for 90 days because they didn't have to collect union dues, and it was a summer thing so that the regular employees could have time off in the summer. And so I worked the first year and then went back to school. The second year, went back and did it and went back to school. And then the third year, this was during the Vietnam War, and I figured that, you know, even if I went back and graduated from, I was going to San Jose State at the time, even if I graduated, they would probably draft me when I got out. So I figured I'd just keep working and until I got drafted, which eventually happened. And so when I got out of the service, I had 3 years of seniority, which saved me a lot of going down to Yuma to work and different things like that. So I worked in LA. At that time I was working at the LA pool, at which I went to Bakersfield and to Indio and all the local jobs around there. And then in 1972 they opened up the whole system to, they called it system seniority. You could go wherever you wanted to on the system. And since I had gone to Cal Poly and knew this area, I decided to come up here and work out of San Luis. And I did that from 1972 until I got injured in a motorcycle accident in 1986. So I kind of know what happened in those years. It was 10 or 15 years of kind of the heyday of railroading in San Luis Obispo. And what I wanted to talk about today was remind people of what an important industry Southern Pacific was in those years, because at that time there were over 200 enginemen and brakemen and conductors, and probably 40 clerks, and a train master, and a road foreman of engines, and a cop, and a couple of secretaries. And did I mention the 40 clerks? And so it was a major employer in the San Luis area. And I understand that during the war it was even a bigger concern than this whole area down here between Broad Street and the Roundhouse was kind of segregated railroad housing. You can check on that. But a lot of trainmen and enginemen lived down there. Another thing I wanted to talk about today was the diversity of the workforce and how many little cliques there were. We always thought that San Luis would make a great soap opera for all the little infighting and that there was between all these interest groups. And some of the interest groups were like the people who came down from Watsonville, who actually had homes in Watsonville, and we called them the apple knockers. And their interest was to spend as little time in San Luis as they could and go back home to their families. And some of them had little shacks up here on the hillside. And you know, when they got called to go to work, they'd just walk down here and go to work. And they wanted to spend as little time down here as they could and then go back. And so the San Luis people, when they went to Watsonville, they wanted to get on the first bus to come back, or the first train, and the guys that lived in Watsonville said, no, don't bother those guys, we want to stay home. So there was that group, and then there were people like me who were kind of the outsiders who came from LA and from different places to work here, and we didn't know anybody here particularly. And the other major group was the old timers. There was the old timers, who some of them had hired out during the war, and some of them even before the war. Some of those guys left over, and then their kids. It was pretty nepotistic. That, you know, if your dad was an engineer, you became an engineer. And I've known at least one family where there were 3 or 4 generations, some of them working at the same time. And it was a little hard for guys like me with long hair and an attitude to break into this whole situation. And then in the, let's see, probably in the mid-70s, they started hiring women and black people and brown people, and you never knew who you were going to go to work with. And that was another whole aspect of working that the old timers had a hard time getting used to. And I was hoping that Pat could have showed up today. She's the last surviving woman that hired out during that time. Anyway, do you have any questions at this point?
No, not really. And
do you want me to just keep talking?
Sure. I am going to go ahead and make a general introduction just for the purposes of our records. This is February 2, 2015. Welcome to the San Luis Obispo Railroad Museum. My name is Glenn Madison, and Bill Walther introduced himself, and operating the equipment today is Tom Mitchell. If you need a break for any reason or a drink of water, let me know.
No, I'm good. If you have any questions, just bust in. And
well,
I'm almost out of materials.
Well, we do try to get.
If you've got any other,
we do try to get from everybody at least one anecdote about something that was pretty serious, maybe kind of scary, and something that was maybe the funniest thing that you can remember.
Well, the reason I think that, like this morning I was having breakfast with a bunch of old rails, and we get together once a month, and it's kind of like war veterans telling stories about the war who civilians wouldn't understand, because it was, most of railroading was hours and days of utter boredom punctuated by minutes of sheer terror, and you never knew when the moment of sheer terror was going to hit you. And sometimes you just never knew. I mean, there's an old railroad song that goes something like, don't mistreat your sweet loving husband, because he may leave you and never return. You ever heard that? I think the name of the song is The Wreck of the Old 97 or something, anyway. But those things did happen. You know, I don't know of anybody personally who got killed railroading, but I know for a fact that my own life passed before my eyes at least half a dozen times. And I tell people that, you know, I spent a year in Vietnam and I never had any life-threatening incidents happen there, but you know, I know of at least 5 or 6 incidents that happened railroading that could have been fatal. And most of them I had nothing to do with instigating. But well, let's see.
Well, we do try to avoid connecting stories that might cast someone in a bad light.
No, most of it was like mechanical stuff.
Well, but if you have a recollection of somebody who maybe was a kind of a character or a joker or got on people's nerves for a particular reason or something like that.
Oh, there are all kinds of those people. I mean, the railroad, it seemed like attracted eccentric people, and you almost had to be a little nuts to want to work here. Mainly because you had no social life. You had, it was a good paying job, and you know, a lot of people benefited from the high wages, and it was probably one of the better paying jobs in San Luis at the time. But you couldn't make a date. In fact, I have one story where two engineers were supposed to be having dinner one night, and so the guy, one of them showed up at the other guy's house, and he was gone, and he asked his wife, well, what happened to so-and-so? And he says, oh, he couldn't make it. Somebody laid off, and he had to go to work. And it turned out that they were both on the extra board, and the guy that was giving the dinner took a call for the guy that laid off so he could go to dinner with him, if you get the implication. So the guest not only missed out on his dinner, but he missed out on a trip to wherever they were going, you know, probably $100 bill at that time, which was a fair amount of money. He talked about it for years afterwards. Let's see, another good story. I could tell you about the time we almost destroyed Oxnard. That's a good story. We were going south, or east as we called it, with a train load of 80-foot pipes on flat cars that were stacked up about 10 high. And we're running ahead of Amtrak. And we wanted to get past Oxnard before they gave us an order to pull into a siding to let Amtrak go by us. So of course, just before you get to Oxnard, there's a 35-mile-an-hour curve. And so the engineer, we won't mention any names, but the engine went around. I was on the head engine, and we got around the curve. The engine got around the curve, and he started widening on him. But by the time the pipes, which were in the middle of the train, hit that curve, we were probably doing at least 50, and the pipes started coming off the flat cars because the centrifugal force, and unloading themselves just beyond the depot. And there was another train that was waiting for us in the siding at Oxnard. And when he saw us coming, he started pulling up to get ready to go out the other end of the yard. And so by the time all the dust had settled and the pipes were all sticking up like jack straws all over the yard, we just barely missed the depot. We figured out that if this guy hadn't have pulled his train further up, there were several cars of chlorine gas and propane in his consist that would have been right in the middle of that derailment. And so anyway, we were way up at the other end of the yard, and and there was a road that went parallel to the track, so I hitched a ride back to the depot, got the yard crew to take off our caboose, and about 6 cars were left on the track. So I got the yard crew to take those 6 cars at our caboose and the conductor and the rear brakeman, run them through the yard and hook them onto the end of our train. And I got on the engine and we shot into LA ahead of Amtrak. And the next day, before the investigation, the engineer retired. Took the pension. And that was just one of the more scary little incidents that happened while I was working there. And the next day they did edit us back from Los Angeles, and we stopped in Oxnard, and there was still a pile of junk. But anyway, those are the kinds of things that did happen. No, let's see, what else?
Any good weather stories?
Oh, yeah. A good weather story was one day I was working in Lompoc, and you may have seen pictures of this. I don't know if anybody actually took a picture of it, but we had a terrible storm, and this must have been in '83 or '4, and I was staying in a motel in Lompoc because I was on the extra board. So I decided to drive in to surf and see if there was anything washed up on the beach. So when I was going around the corner to go into Lompoc, I noticed that the bridge had completely washed out, and all there was left standing was just the rail, and the ties were going across the San Ynez River. And I said, well, I don't think we're going to be going to work today. But then that bridge was washed out for at least a month while they rebuilt it.
You mentioned you had some tunnel stories, but not from Cuesta. Were those from Tehachapi or down by Santa Susana?
My favorite tunnel story was the big tunnel in the Santa Susana Mountains. I've forgotten the number of the tunnel, but it's about a mile-long tunnel, and we were about 20 car lengths into the tunnel, and our train broke in two. And what causes that is wheel slip on the engines. You're going up a grade with a really heavy train, and the wheels start slipping, and the slack runs in a little bit, and then the wheels catch, and it can actually pull the knuckles apart in the middle of the train, especially if it's heavier in the back than in the front. So anyway, our train snapped in two, and we were 4 big engines and about 20 car lengths into the tunnel. So I told the fireman to shut down all but one engine, and I was going to run back through the tunnel, grab my lantern, and cut off enough cars that when we came back, we could, with just the engines, we could grab the rest of the train. And so I did that, cut the cars off, and we pulled 25 cars out of the tunnel into Chatsworth and left them there, and then went back with the engine and hooked up with the rest of the train and got it together, and then pulled it through the tunnel, and then got our train together. By that time, we were dead on the law, which was, well, we were only allowed to work 12 hours at a time. I don't know if you're familiar with that aspect of railroading. And by that time, a relief crew had come, and they took the train into LA. Oh, I should probably mention that when I first started working that here in '64, they still had the 16-hour law. So you could legally work for 16 hours at a time, and before they had to relieve you. And when I came back from the service, they reduced it to 14 hours, and then I think in '73 or '4 they reduced it to 12 hours. But when I first started working, I was totally amazed that, here I was, a 19-year-old kid, and there were guys there in their 50s and 60s who worked 15 hours and 59 minutes, which allowed them to go back to work the next day after 8 hours rest. and do it over again.
8 hours between signing out and signing back in.
Yeah,
it might be 4 hours rest.
And they might get 4 hours rest at home, and so there was a fair amount of sleeping on the job and stuff for people who were lucky enough to have cabooses. But some of the yard jobs, those guys were out there switching boxcars for 16 hours a day. You know, and these were old men. And I should also mention that railroaders had their own language, that you could be out there switching boxcars all day and you never had to say a word to anybody. I don't know if civilians are aware of that, but they had like sign languages, you know, to tell how many cars, which tracks to put them in. And you could practically do all your talking with sign language, because this was back in the days before handheld radios, and you know, and it was noisy and it was dark and it was, you know, long distances, so you couldn't shout at each other, and you had to develop a way to pass signs that they were mutually intelligible. And some of them were kind of ingenious, like
So these are mostly by hand or lantern.
by hand or lantern. Like this was 7, meaning when you're throwing dice, you're hoping for a 7, and this one was to make a drop, like a chicken, like laying eggs. Yeah, and you're supposed to know all this stuff. And so it took young guys a long time to learn all the signs, and the old guys would get really pissed at you if you didn't know what they were talking about.
I thought you were just trying to be funny.
Yeah,
like a chicken. It needs more rest.
And God help you if you misread one of their signs, like if they gave you a 3 sign and you cut off 2 cards, or you cut off 4 cards, and then they'd have to go back down into the track and pull one of the cars out that you had sent down there by mistake. But I'm aware that now none of that is allowed, that you can't get on and off of moving cars at all. So, and you can't be running along the side of the, you know, it's all totally safety conscious, you know, everything's safety. You know, because so many people are losing their arms and legs, lives and stuff. Any other questions?
I can't think of anything. Tom, can you chime in?
No, it sounds like a lot of railroading was like law enforcement. We had our own language, our own signals, our own signs.
For sure, yeah.
And we didn't have a 16-hour rule. You worked until it was done, you know.
Yeah. So I think a lot of the romance and a lot of the fun has gone out of it, from what I understand. But I think I kind of worked during the most fun part of railroading, and before that, I think it was a lot more work. You hear the old timers talking about steam engines and stuff, and you know, everyone thought that steam engines were all romantic and stuff, but those guys kind of made fun of us younger people who had never done it, and because it was very hard work, and you worked for 16 hours at a time, and the conductors acted like drill sergeants, and you could get fired for infractions of rules easily. I should probably also mention, getting back to the number of people who were working here, that during the war, there were probably 10 people on every train, and because of the fact that they didn't have dynamic braking on the locomotives. So you'd have 10 people get on a train in St. Louis, and they rode, I guess they rode in the cabooses, and then when they started going downhill, they all unloaded from the cabooses and walked along the top of the cars, and each of them, about every 10 or 20 cars, they manned their brake clubs and going down the hill. That's when brakemen were called brakemen, because that's what they did. They had to slow the train down manually. going down the hill, and the conductor would sit up in the little cupola cabooses and make sure that these guys were what they called decorating the train. So he could look along the tops of the boxcars and see these guys out there with their lanterns, especially at night. And they had special whistles from the engineer. You know, we were supposed to memorize this stuff even when I first started working here. That, you know, all the whistle sounds were supposed to mean something, although none of us actually knew what most of the whistles.
Like applying brakes and
Yeah,
releasing
applying
brakes and calling in flagman.
and calling in the flagman, and you know, that sort of thing. So and then when they got to Margarita, they all got off and went to the switchman, or the shanty down there, or the depot or whatever, and waited for the next train to come over the hill. Then I'll get back on and ride back down the hill again. So that took probably a considerable number of trainmen for that. And I can just imagine going down that hill on a rainy, windswept night, walking along the top of freight boxcars and maybe climbing over lumber cars and whatever. And then probably in the mid-70s they took all the tops of all the cars off, so you couldn't do that anymore. But I can remember, especially in crowded small yards like in LA, at the Port of LA, there was little snaky yards, and you had to get up on top of the cars to pass signals, because that was the only way you could see each other.
The ladders don't even go up that high
No,
anymore.
and then they cut the ladders off, so there was only like 4 rungs, and they lowered the brake handles so that you could only stand on these little platforms between the cars and apply the brakes.
Yeah, you mentioned that kind of at the start of your career there, especially if you were in train service, you had to be a white man.
Oh yeah,
and then as the workforce started to get more diverse, and I bet some of the people who were the new hires that were, different than the local people handled it better than others. Do you have any recollections of some who were?
Well, I only know a few instances because I'm not black. But when I first hired out, white people had the engineers' jobs and the trainmen's jobs. Black people were chair car porters, and they carried the baggage and did the cooking on the passenger trains. And the Mexicans mostly took care of the right of way. They pounded the spikes and made sure the ballast was all there. And it was pretty much segregated in that way. And then I think probably in the early 70s, Johnson came along with the equal opportunity law that said that anybody who has contracts with the government has to desegregate or open up employment to everybody. And that's when women started coming in, and they started bringing in different racial groups into the train and engine service. And when I was down in LA, there was some diversity because they were pretty much discontinuing passenger service at the same time. So some of the chair car porters and those kinds of people went from that job into train service, and they were the ones, I wouldn't exactly call them Uncle Toms, but they tried to fit into the culture, and bought big cars and went golfing and tried to do the same things that these old white guys did. And then there were other guys that they kind of hired off the streets, and some of them were from the projects and stuff, and they just weren't taking the same kind of guff that the older guys were having to endure from mostly a lot of, I would say a lot of the old timers were racist. There's just no other way to cut it. And I remember one story I heard. This old conductor was challenged this young black kid to a fight, and he like, locked the both sides of the caboose, and threw the keys on top of this coal-burning stove, and was going to have it out with his kid. And he didn't know that this kid had been, Golden Gloves boxers, and just beat the crap out of him. Before you knew it, the conductor was trying to grab these red-hot keys off the top of the stove to let himself out of the caboose to keep from getting his ass whipped. But those things happened, and eventually people learned to get along with each other, and the ones that couldn't cut it, I guess, left, or figured that the money wasn't worth it or whatever. But yeah, I do remember another story about this black fireman, and they were short of men, so they called this guy up to go to work. And he said, no, I couldn't make it. And so the road foreman of engines in LA called this guy up. Says, how come you can't come to work? And he says, hey, Mr. Rollins, you ain't never been a nigga on Saturday night, have you? And somehow or another he got out of going to work that night. But there was a culture clash, and especially when women started coming to work here, that was, these guys considered themselves to be rough, tough, trained people and engineers, and what's this woman doing here? She couldn't possibly do this job. But most of them hung in there, and for a while anyway. There's a great book called Boomer that one of the sisters wrote that talked about that. If you can find it. In fact, she wrote a couple of books in there. They're quite good. Anything else?
Can't think of anything. How about this building? Any recollections of what was going on in here?
Oh, in this building, it was kind of a derelict, and I understand that I was never here at the time, but they had the wide gauge was on this side of the building, and the narrow gauge was on this side, and they could offload the stuff from the wide gauge and put it onto the narrow gauge, and vice versa. And then they took it wherever it went. But most of the time it was used as like refrigerator storage, and I think Sears may have rented it, and they stored appliances in here and stuff. And then towards the end, when they got out of here, homeless people were in here used it to sleep in and stuff. But yeah, it was pretty funky for a long time. I'm sure glad you guys were able to save it. And unfortunately, you lost the roundhouse and the turntable. And I was just talking to Louis this morning, who's the roundhouse foreman, and he said that he actually called somebody at the city when they were talking about demolishing the turntable, and the city said they didn't want it, weren't interested, which would have made a real contribution to this railroad part of town, because that was kind of a centerpiece of the I only used that turntable once that I can remember. We had to turn a flat car with a trailer on it because it was faced the wrong way. So that they couldn't unload it. They had a ramp in Guadalupe that they unloaded. They call it TOFCs, trailer on flat car. And so, but you had to have it faced the right way to get a tractor in there to pull it off. Yeah, that was pretty interesting. Let's see what else. But to get back to the employee situation, it was kind of a big dysfunctional family. And everybody knew each other and knew each other's wives and their kids, and it was, from what I understand, I didn't actually see any of this personally, but there was a lot of incestuousness running around at the time, where you could tell who was in town, where they were, and there was a fair amount of indecent behavior, you might say, among the trainmen and enginemen and their wives and their sweethearts and stuff, because you could always tell who was out of town, how long they were going to be out of town, so that if somebody knew that their buddy was out of town, he could mix it up with his girlfriend or wife, and there was a fair amount of divorces going on and stuff because of that. And you'd have to ask somebody older than me to verify that, but it happened. Let's see, what else? Well, like I was saying, you could have written a TV sitcom about, you know, the little interactions between people that are going on here. And part of the reason I'm doing this interview is that at some point in history, somebody's going to write a book about, you know, railroading in San Luis, and it'd be nice to know that it wasn't just machinery and different kinds of engines and stuff, but there were actually people working here that interacted with each other. And a lot of it was pretty interesting.
That's why we appreciate your coming in and spending time with us.
Okay.